My name is Valerie Knox. For 10 years, I've been the invisible backbone of Northern Sky Medevac, Alaska's premier air ambulance service. Not the face on the brochures or the voice at press conferences, I'm the one who makes sure our helicopters fly, our medics are equipped, and people in the most remote corners of the last frontier don't die waiting for help. Today is my 35th birthday. It should have been unremarkable, just another Tuesday at the coordination center. Instead, it became the day I reclaimed what was always meant to be mine. The morning dawned clear and frigid, typical for early October in Anchorage. I arrived at the hangar at 5:15 a.m., same as I had for the past decade. The familiar scent of aviation fuel, coffee, and the faint antiseptic smell from the medical supplies greeted me as I pushed through the heavy door. Most of the staff wouldn't arrive for another hour, but I cherished this quiet time when I could hear the building breathe, the gentle hum of the heating system, the occasional ping from the dispatch computer, the soft ticking of the massive wall clock my father had installed when he founded Northern Sky 27 years ago. My father, Jack Knox. The man who taught me that every bolt on an aircraft matters, every second in a medical emergency counts. And respect isn't commanded with fancy titles, but earned through competence and care. He'd been gone for 14 years now. But some mornings, like today, I could almost feel him beside me at the dispatch desk, his calloused hand on my shoulder, his voice rough but gentle. "Val, this isn't just a business, it's a lifeline." I settled at my station, logging into the systems one by one, checking the weather reports across our service area. 3 of our 5 helicopters were currently active, 1 returning from overnight maintenance, 2 on standby for emergency calls. Standard procedure dictated that I review yesterday's mission logs before assigning today's cruise. As I scrolled through the reports, a familiar unease settled in my stomach. Response times were slipping. Again, not catastrophically, but enough that I'd noticed the pattern over the past 8 months. Ever since Darren Whitmore had been appointed CEO and began his modernization initiative. Ever since the board had decided Northern Sky needed a more dynamic presence at its helm rather than the chief mechanic's daughter who'd worked her way up from dispatch to operations manager. I pulled up the maintenance schedule, frowning at the delayed inspections. We used to pride ourselves on exceeding FAA requirements. Now we were barely meeting minimum standards. The new social media budget, however, had tripled. Apparently, it was more important to have sleek Instagram stories than properly serviced tail rotors. The hangar door opened, letting in a blast of Arctic air, and Marcus Chen, our chief medical officer and one of the few remaining employees from my father's era. "Morning, Val," he said, stamping snow from his boots. "Happy birthday." I smiled, touched that he remembered. "Thanks, Marcus. How was the Kenai call yesterday?" His expression darkened slightly. "We got there in time, but it was close. That extra 15 minutes for refueling at the new station instead of using our old route, it matters." "I know," I said quietly. "I've scheduled a meeting with Darren about it this afternoon." Marcus gave me a look that said everything without saying anything. We both knew how these meetings typically went. Darren would listen with that practiced, concerned expression. Promise to take it under advisement, then proceed to explain why his MBA from Wharton gave him unique insight into optimizing our operations that apparently 35 years of combined experience between Marcus and me couldn't provide. "Well, good luck," Marcus said, heading toward the staff room. "Oh, and there's a box of those maple donuts you like in there. Consider it a birthday conspiracy." I laughed, grateful for the small kindness. "You're enabling my worst habits, Dr. Chen. That's what friends do." He called over his shoulder. I turned back to my monitors, but my mind wandered to the birthday traditions of years past. My father had always made them special, even after my mother died when I was 12. He'd wake me with blueberry pancakes, no matter how early his shift started. And there would always be a small, thoughtful gift waiting at my place at the table. After he died, the traditions faded, replaced by quiet acknowledgments from longtime colleagues and the occasional dinner with Ruth, my father's lawyer and my reluctant godmother. This year felt different, though. There was a heaviness to the day I couldn't explain, a sense of anticipation that had kept me awake most of the night. Perhaps it was just turning 35, officially closer to 40 than 30. Or perhaps it was something more. The morning passed in its usual rhythm of calls, coordination, and problem-solving. I assigned crews, monitored weather systems, redirected resources when a multi-car accident near Fairbanks required 2 of our helicopters. It was the work I loved, the intricate dance of logistics that meant the difference between life and death in a state where the nearest hospital could be hundreds of miles away. At 11:30, I finally took a break, grabbing one of Marcus's contraband donuts and a cup of coffee before heading to my small office to prepare for my meeting with Darren. I'd compiled all the data, response times before and after the new refueling protocols, maintenance delays, staff turnover rates that had skyrocketed under his leadership. Numbers didn't lie, and these told a damning story. I was reviewing the final slides of my presentation when my office door opened without a knock. Darren Whitmore stood in the doorway, immaculately dressed in a tailored suit that had probably cost more than most of our emergency medical technicians made in a month. Behind him stood Melissa Carrington, the HR director he'd hired 6 months ago, and Bradley West, the CFO who had once been my ally, but had quickly aligned himself with Darren after his appointment. Something cold settled in my chest at the sight of them. "Valerie," Darren said, his voice carrying that practiced warmth that never reached his eyes. "Do you have a moment?" Without waiting for an answer, he entered, Melissa and Bradley filing in behind him. I closed my laptop, straightening in my chair. "I was just preparing for our 2 p.m. meeting," I said. "I've got some concerning data about our response protocols that we need to address immediately." Darren smiled thinly. "That's actually what I wanted to discuss with you. There's been a change of plans." He gestured to Melissa, who stepped forward, placing a folder on my desk with mechanical precision. "Northern Sky is moving in a new direction," Darren continued, his tone shifting to what I recognized as his boardroom voice, confident, slightly condescending, brooking no argument. "We're implementing a more aggressive expansion strategy, focusing on corporate contracts and VIP medical transport. It requires a different kind of leadership in operations." I didn't touch the folder. "Different how?" "We need someone with a stronger public-facing presence," he said smoothly. "Someone who embodies the modern, dynamic image we're cultivating for Northern Sky. Less of a, well, frankly, less of a schoolmarm behind a desk and more of a visionary who can represent us to potential high-value clients." The insult was so casual, so dismissive, that for a moment I couldn't respond. In the silence, Bradley shifted uncomfortably, not quite meeting my eyes. "You're firing me," I said finally, my voice steady despite the thundering of my heart. "Restructuring your position," Melissa corrected with practiced smoothness. "Effective immediately. The details of your severance package are in the folder. It's quite generous, considering your tenure." I looked at each of them in turn. These people who thought they knew what Northern Sky was, what it should be. None of them had ever been on a rescue mission. None of them had held the hand of a terrified patient as our helicopters battled through a snowstorm to reach a hospital. None of them had worked alongside my father as he built this company from a single helicopter and a dream of serving the people others couldn't reach. I should have been angry. I should have argued, pointed out that my department consistently outperformed all others, that I knew more about our operations than anyone alive. Instead, a strange calm settled over me. "I see," I said quietly, standing up. I reached for the nameplate on my desk, Valerie Knox, Operations Director, running my thumb over the engraved letters my father had personally ordered on my first day in this position. "And who will be taking over my duties?" "We've hired Cameron Hayes from West Coast Air Medical," Darren said, clearly relieved I wasn't making a scene. "He starts next week. Until then, Bradley will oversee operations." Bradley had the decency to look uncomfortable. "We'll need a full handover, of course. Your expertise is valuable." I placed my nameplate in my bag and looked around the small office. There wasn't much else that was truly mine. A photo of my father beside our first helicopter. a worn copy of the Alaska Flight Operations Manual he'd given me when I earned my pilot's license, a spare sweater for the cold mornings. I gathered these items methodically. My access credentials? I asked, unpinning my ID badge. Melissa stepped forward with an envelope. Your final paycheck will be processed today. We'll need your keys and security cards. I handed them over, feeling the weight of a decade slipping through my fingers. Then I picked up my bag and walked to the door, where Darren still stood, already looking past me to the future he envisioned. I paused beside him. Good luck with the optics, I said softly. Something flickered in his eyes. Uncertainty? Perhaps. Or the first hint of doubt. But I didn't wait to see it bloom. I walked out of my office, past the dispatch desk where I'd spent countless hours, through the hangar where mechanics looked up in confusion at my departure, and into the bright, cold afternoon. Only when I reached my car did I allow myself to feel the magnitude of what had just happened. My hands shook as I placed my bag on the passenger seat. 14 years of my life dedicated to Northern Sky, to my father's legacy, gone in a 5-minute conversation. But as I started the engine, that strange calm returned, along with a clarity I hadn't felt in months. Darren thought he'd won. He thought he'd removed an obstacle to his vision of Northern Sky as a luxury service for those who could pay premium rates, rather than the vital lifeline for all Alaskans that my father had created. What Darren didn't know, what none of them knew, was that today wasn't just my 35th birthday. According to the letter I'd received from Ruth Elbridge last week, it was also the day I needed to come see her about your father's final arrangements. I'd assumed it was some forgotten insurance policy or perhaps a sentimental item he'd wanted me to have once I reached this age. Now, I wondered if it might be something more. I pulled out my phone and dialed Ruth's number. When she answered, I didn't waste time with pleasantries. I need to see you today, I said. I've just been fired from Northern Sky. There was a long pause, then a soft exhalation that might have been surprise or might have been something else entirely. Well, Ruth said finally. Jack always did have impeccable timing. Come to my office at 3. And Valerie? Bring all your documentation about the company, everything. The drive to Ruth's downtown office took longer than usual, the streets clogged with early afternoon traffic and construction. It gave me too much time to think, to replay the dismissal in my head, to imagine the smug satisfaction on Darren's face as he reported to the board that he'd finally removed the last vestige of the old guard from Northern Sky's leadership. Ruth Elbridge's law practice occupied the top floor of one of Anchorage's older buildings, a place of polished wood and frosted glass that felt unchanged by time. Her receptionist, a woman who seemed to have been there since the building's construction, nodded in recognition as I entered. She's expecting you, she said, gesturing toward Ruth's office door. Go right in. Ruth stood as I entered, a tall, angular woman in her 60s with silver hair cut in a precise bob and eyes that missed nothing. She had been my father's lawyer, confidant, and friend for decades. And after his death, she had become my reluctant guardian, not legally, as I had been 19 when he died, but in all the ways that mattered. She had guided me through the wilderness of grief, had advised me when I joined Northern Sky full-time, had celebrated my promotions and commiserated over my setbacks. Now, she studied me with an intensity that made me straighten my spine. You're handling this well, she observed, gesturing for me to sit in one of the leather chairs facing her desk. I'm in shock, I admitted. It hasn't fully hit me yet. She nodded, then opened a drawer in her desk and removed a thick manila envelope, yellowed slightly with age. On the front, in my father's distinctive handwriting, was written, For Valerie Knox, on her 35th birthday. Your father left this with me 14 years ago, Ruth said, placing it on the desk between us. He was very specific about when it should be given to you. Not before your 35th birthday, not after. He said you would understand why when you opened it. I stared at the envelope, at the handwriting so familiar it made my chest ache. Did he know? About what would happen today? Ruth's expression softened slightly. Jack Knox was many things, but he wasn't psychic. However, he did understand people, and he understood business. He knew that eventually, someone would try to take Northern Sky in a direction he never intended. She pushed the envelope toward me. "Open it, Valerie." With careful fingers, I broke the seal and emptied the contents onto the desk. Inside were legal documents, bound together with a faded blue ribbon, and a sealed letter with my name on it. I reached for the letter first, but Ruth shook her head. "The documents first," she said. "Then his words will make more sense." I untied the ribbon and began to read. At first, the legal terminology made it difficult to grasp what I was seeing, but as I continued, the reality of what my father had done became clear, and my breath caught in my throat. "This is—" I looked up at Ruth, unable to complete the sentence. "A transfer of ownership," she confirmed, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "Specifically, 92% of Northern Sky Medevac's total shares held in trust until your 35th birthday. Today, those shares legally transfer to you, making you the majority shareholder of Northern Sky, by quite a significant margin." I stared at her, then back at the documents, trying to process what this meant. "But how? The board? The other shareholders?" "The board knows nothing about this," Ruth said, leaning forward. "When Jack founded Northern Sky, he retained majority ownership. As the company grew, he allowed limited investment from selected partners, but he was careful never to dilute his control below 92%. After his death, those shares were placed in a blind trust that I administered, with instructions that the board be told only that a legacy shareholder held the majority interest but wished to remain passive in company governance." "For 14 years?" I asked, incredulous. "Your father's instructions were explicit," Ruth said. "The trust would continue until you turned 35, at which point full control would transfer to you. He wanted you to learn the business from the ground up, to earn your position on merit, not inheritance. And he wanted you to see how people would treat me when they thought I had no power." I finished quietly, finally understanding. I picked up the letter, breaking the seal with trembling fingers. My father's familiar handwriting filled the page. "My dearest Valerie, if you're reading this, you've reached your 35th birthday, and Ruth has fulfilled her promise to me. First, happy birthday, kiddo. I wish more than anything that I could be there to celebrate with you, to see the woman you've become. By now, you've seen the documents transferring ownership of Northern Sky to you. I founded this company with a simple mission: to reach those who couldn't be reached, to save those who might otherwise be lost. It was never about profit margins or corporate contracts. It was about service, about using our skills and our technology to make a difference in the hardest places. I kept this arrangement secret for a reason. I wanted you to learn Northern Sky from the inside out, to understand every gear and bolt, every protocol and procedure. But more importantly, I wanted you to know how people behave when they think you have no power, when they underestimate you because you're young, or because you're a woman, or because you're not the loudest voice in the room. Now you know. And now you have a choice to make. Northern Sky is yours. You can sell it and walk away a wealthy woman. You can continue as you have been, allowing others to steer its course. Or you can take the controls and fly it true to its purpose. Whatever you decide, know that I am proud of you. Not for what you own, but for who you are. All my love, Dad P.S. Remember what I taught you about flying in a storm? The same applies here. Keep your eyes on the horizon, your hands steady on the controls, and trust your instruments. The rest is just noise." I read the letter twice, then carefully folded it and returned it to its envelope. When I looked up, Ruth was watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Did you know?" I asked. "All these years. Did you know what was happening at Northern Sky?" She nodded slowly. "I've kept an eye on things, as Jack asked me to. The current board has made questionable decisions. Darren Whitmore was hired because he promised to increase profitability by expanding into luxury medical transport and corporate contracts, the kind of service that caters to oil executives and wealthy tourists. not fishermen in remote villages or hikers lost in the mountains. I thought of the slipping response times, the delayed maintenance, the increased emphasis on appearances over substance. They're dismantling everything my father built. Yes, Ruth said simply, and now you have the power to stop them. She leaned forward, her eyes intent on mine. So, Valerie Knox, what are you going to do with Northern Sky Medevac? The answer came without hesitation, rising from some deep place of certainty within me. I'm going to take it back. Ruth's smile was sharp and satisfied. I was hoping you'd say that. Now, let's talk strategy. For the next 2 hours, Ruth and I pored over company bylaws, shareholder agreements, and board meeting minutes. As the majority shareholder, I had the right to call an emergency shareholder meeting with minimal notice. I could vote to remove board members, including the CEO, effective immediately. But we need more than just your shares, Ruth cautioned. We need evidence of mismanagement, of decisions that have harmed the company's core mission and financial health. The remaining 8% of shareholders might not have enough votes to block you, but they could make things difficult if they unite against you. I thought of the data I'd compiled for my meeting with Darren, the evidence of declining performance and increasing expenses. I have some of that already, I said, but I need more. I need to know exactly what they've been doing with the company's resources. Ruth nodded. As majority shareholder, you can authorize a financial audit, but that takes time if you want to move quickly. I need someone on the inside, I finished. Someone who has access to the financial records and is willing to help me. I thought of the employees I knew, the ones who had been with Northern Sky for years and might share my concerns about its new direction. Bradley was out. He had clearly allied himself with Darren. But there was Jenny Winters in accounting, who had worked closely with my father and had always treated me with respect. And Michael Taft in dispatch, who had expressed frustration with the new protocols that prioritize corporate clients over emergency calls. I have a few ideas, I said, but I'll need to be careful. If Darren suspects anything, he'll start covering his tracks. Ruth agreed. You'll need to move fast, but strategically. And Valerie, remember that this isn't just about reclaiming your father's company. It's about ensuring that Northern Sky continues to serve the people who need it most. I nodded, feeling the weight of responsibility settling on my shoulders. I know. That's why I can't let them turn it into a luxury taxi service for the privileged few. As I gathered the documents, Ruth placed a hand on my arm. Your father would be proud of you, not just for fighting for Northern Sky, but for becoming the kind of person who understands why it's worth fighting for. I swallowed hard against the sudden tightness in my throat. Thank you, Ruth, for everything. She squeezed my arm once, then let go. Don't thank me yet. We've got a lot of work to do. The next morning, I began my investigation in earnest. My first call was to Jenny Winters, asking if she could meet me for coffee before work. She agreed readily, sounding relieved to hear from me. News of my dismissal had apparently spread quickly through the company. We met at a small cafe several blocks from Northern Sky's headquarters, away from the usual haunts of the staff. Jenny arrived bundled against the morning chill, her face lined with concern. Val, what happened? She asked as soon as she sat down. Marcus told me Darren fired you yesterday, but he wouldn't say why. Apparently. I'm not the right image for the new Northern Sky, I said, keeping my tone light despite the anger simmering beneath. Too much of a schoolmarm behind a desk, according to Darren. Jenny's expression hardened. That's ridiculous. You're the most competent person in that entire building. Thank you, I said, warmed by her loyalty. But I didn't ask you here to complain about Darren. I need your help. Jenny, I'm concerned about what's happening at Northern Sky, about the direction it's taking, the delayed maintenance, the shifting priorities, the emphasis on corporate clients over emergency services. Jenny glanced around, then leaned closer. You should be concerned. It's worse than you know. The new budget Darren pushed through last month, it cuts maintenance funding by 30% while increasing the marketing and client relations budget by 150%. Client relations, I repeated, frowning. That's the code for the expenses Darren incurs wooing potential corporate clients. Jenny explained. Fancy dinners, fishing expeditions, even a weekend retreat at Alyeska Resort for executives from Polar Star Oil. All on the company dime. I felt a cold anger building as she continued, detailing how funds were being redirected from essential services to cosmetic improvements and promotional activities. How staff training budgets had been slashed while Darren had hired 3 new brand ambassadors at salaries higher than most of our senior medical staff. Can you get me documentation of all this? I asked. Financial reports, budget allocations, expense accounts? Jenny hesitated. That would be risky. If Darren found out, I understand, I said quickly. I wouldn't ask if it wasn't important. But Northern Sky is meant to be a lifeline for all Alaskans, not a luxury service for corporations. What Darren's doing, it's not just changing the company's direction. It's betraying its purpose. She studied me for a long moment, then nodded decisively. I'll help. But Val, what can you do? You're not with the company anymore. I considered how much to tell her, then decided on a partial truth. I'm gathering evidence of mismanagement to present to the board and the other shareholders. They may not care about Northern Sky's mission the way we do, but they'll care if Darren's actions are putting their investment at risk. It wasn't the whole story, but it was enough. Jenny agreed to compile the financial records I needed and get them to me by the end of the week. As we parted, she hugged me tightly. Be careful, Val, she whispered. Darren has friends on the board, powerful friends. I squeezed her back. I will be. And Jenny? Thank you. My next stop was Michael Taft's apartment. As the senior dispatcher, Michael had a unique perspective on how Northern Sky's operations had changed under Darren's leadership. He answered the door in sweatpants and a faded Northern Sky t-shirt, clearly just woken from sleep after his night shift. Val, he said, blinking in surprise. What are you doing here? I need to talk to you about Northern Sky, I said. May I come in? Over strong coffee at his kitchen table, I listened as Michael confirmed my worst fears. Emergency response times had indeed increased, not just because of the new refueling protocols, but because corporate transport requests were being given priority over some emergency calls. Last week, we had a situation, Michael said, his voice tight with controlled anger. A fishing boat capsized near Kodiak, 4 men in the water. Our closest helicopter was at Seward, but it was scheduled for a VIP transport, some banker who wanted to get to his vacation home and didn't want to wait for a commercial flight. Darren himself called down to dispatch and told me to keep that helicopter on standby for the VIP. I felt sick. What happened to the fisherman? I ignored him, Michael said flatly. Sent the helicopter to Kodiak. The Coast Guard was responding too. But our medic got there first, got 2 of the men stabilized before the Coast Guard arrived. Probably saved their lives. He ran a hand through his thinning hair. Darren was furious, put a formal reprimand in my file for failing to follow direct instructions from senior management. That's not how we operate, I said, the anger now a burning coal in my chest. That's never been how Northern Sky operates. It is now, Michael said bitterly. Or at least, that's what Darren wants. Most of us are fighting back where we can, making judgment calls in the moment. But he shook his head. It's getting harder. He's replacing people who push back. Rumor has it I'm next on the chopping block. I reached across the table and gripped his hand. I need you to document all of this. Every incident where emergency services were delayed or compromised because of Darren's priorities. Names, dates, outcomes. Michael looked at me skeptically. What good will that do now? You're gone, Val. And from what I hear, the board is fully behind Darren's vision for the company. The board isn't the only power at Northern Sky, I said carefully. Trust me, Michael. This information matters. He studied my face, then nodded slowly. All right. I'll get you what I can. But Val, whatever you're planning, Be careful. Darren plays dirty. I smiled grimly. So do I. When I have to. Over the next 3 days, I worked from Ruth's office, compiling evidence and building my case against Darren Whitmore and the board members who had enabled him. Jenny came through with financial records that painted a damning picture of resource misallocation and questionable expenses. Michael provided detailed logs of incidents where corporate priorities had compromised emergency services. I also reached out to Marcus Chen, who supplied documentation of medical equipment that had been downgraded or delayed to save costs, potentially putting patients at risk. And to my surprise, 3 other longtime employees contacted me independently, offering their own evidence of Northern Sky's deterioration under Darren's leadership. By Friday, I had a comprehensive file that clearly demonstrated how Darren's modernization of Northern Sky was undermining its core mission and potentially exposing it to significant liability. Ruth reviewed the evidence with her customary thoroughness, adding notes where legal vulnerabilities were particularly clear. This is more than enough to justify removing him as CEO, she concluded, closing the file with a decisive snap. The question now is timing. When do you want to call the shareholder meeting? I considered. According to Michael, the board had scheduled a strategic planning session for Monday afternoon, where Darren would be presenting his vision for Northern Sky's next phase of brand evolution. All board members would be present, along with the senior leadership team, or what remained of it after Darren's restructuring. Monday, I decided. During their strategic planning meeting, if we're going to do this, let's do it when they're all together. When Darren is at his most confident. Ruth raised an eyebrow. You want to catch him mid-presentation. That's a bit theatrical, isn't it? I thought of my father's letter, of his words about seeing how people behave when they think you have no power. I thought of Darren's dismissive tone as he fired me, of the casual way he had referred to me as a school marm behind a desk. Yes, I said, a cold satisfaction settling in my chest. It is theatrical, and it's exactly what Darren deserves. Ruth's smile was slow but appreciative. Monday it is, then. I'll prepare the formal notice of an emergency shareholder meeting. As majority shareholder, you have the right to call it without advance notice, but we should follow proper procedure to avoid any potential challenges later. I nodded, suddenly feeling the enormity of what we were about to do. Ruth, when this is over, what happens to Northern Sky? I know how to run operations, but I'm not sure I know how to run an entire company. She regarded me steadily. You know more than you think, Valerie. You've been watching and learning for 14 years, but you don't have to do it alone. You can appoint a new board, hire executives who share your vision for what Northern Sky should be. People who understand that it's about service, not profit margins, I murmured, echoing my father's words. Exactly, Ruth said. Your father built Northern Sky to serve a purpose. Now you get to ensure it continues to fulfill that purpose. She gathered her papers, preparing to draft the shareholder meeting notice. Get some rest this weekend. Monday will be intense. I spent the weekend in a state of focused calm, reviewing my evidence one last time, rehearsing what I would say, preparing for every possible reaction from Darren and the board. I also reached out to a few key employees, Marcus, Jenny, Michael, asking them to be available Monday afternoon without explaining why. If all went as planned, I would need allies in place to help stabilize Northern Sky after the inevitable chaos of Darren's removal. By Monday morning, I felt ready. I dressed with care in my father's old flight jacket over a simple black dress, professional but unmistakably connected to Northern Sky's roots. Ruth met me at her office, equally prepared in a sharp charcoal suit, the formal shareholder meeting notice and multiple copies of our evidence file in her briefcase. Are you ready? She asked as we prepared to leave for Northern Sky's headquarters. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of my father's jacket on my shoulders, the solidity of the evidence in my hands, the certainty of my purpose in my heart. Yes, I said. I'm ready. Northern Sky's headquarters were housed in a modern building near the airport, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering views of the mountain range that had given the company its name. The receptionist in the sleek lobby looked startled to see me, but didn't try to stop us as we headed for the elevators. My access card had been deactivated, but Ruth simply pressed the intercom button and stated that we had an appointment with the board. Someone buzzed us through, perhaps assuming we were expected consultants for the strategic planning session. As we rode the elevator to the top floor, I felt a curious sense of detachment, as if I were watching myself from a distance. This building, with its contemporary art and minimalist furniture, bore little resemblance to the utilitarian hangar where my father had started Northern Sky, where I had grown up learning the business from the ground up. Darren's influence was everywhere. In the redesigned logo that emphasized Sky over Northern, in the promotional photos showing gleaming helicopters against dramatic landscapes, with no patients or medical equipment in sight. It was a sanitized version of Northern Sky, one that erased the blood and fear and desperate hope that were the reality of emergency medical transport in Alaska's unforgiving terrain. The boardroom doors were closed when we arrived, but through the glass walls, I could see Darren standing at the head of the table, gesturing animatedly at a presentation displayed on the large screen behind him. The board members, 8 men and 2 women, most of whom had never set foot in a medical helicopter, watched with varying degrees of attention. I recognized the slides from my brief glimpse, sleek marketing materials for Northern Sky Elite, the premium service Darren was developing for corporate clients and wealthy individuals. The very concept turned my stomach. Ruth placed a steadying hand on my arm. "Ready?" I nodded, and she pushed open the door without knocking. The conversation inside stopped abruptly as heads turned toward us. Darren froze mid-gesture, his expression shifting from surprise to anger as he recognized me. "Ms. Knox," he said coldly, "this is a private meeting. You no longer have access to these premises." "Actually," Ruth said, stepping forward and placing a document on the table. "As majority shareholder of Northern Sky Medevac, Ms. Knox has every right to be here. This is a formal notice of an emergency shareholder meeting, called under Article 7, Section 3 of the company bylaws. That meeting is now in session." The silence that followed was absolute. Darren stared at the document, then at me, his face draining of color. The board members exchanged confused glances, several reaching for the notice to verify what Ruth had just said. "This is ridiculous," Darren finally sputtered. "There is no majority shareholder. Northern Sky's ownership is divided among the board and several private investors, including a trust that holds 92% of all shares," Ruth said, removing more documents from her briefcase and placing them on the table. "A trust that, as of last Tuesday, transferred full ownership of those shares to Valerie Knox, as stipulated by her father, Jack Knox, the founder of Northern Sky Medevac." She began distributing copies of the ownership transfer documents to each board member. "As you can see, the documentation is all in order. Ms. Knox now controls 92% of Northern Sky Medevac, making this shareholder meeting both legal and binding." The board erupted in confused exclamations and urgent whispers. A few members examined the documents with growing alarm, while others looked to Darren for explanation or denial. But Darren himself seemed frozen, his carefully cultivated confidence crumbling visibly as he stared at me. "This is impossible," he finally managed. "Jack Knox died 14 years ago. The company ownership was restructured after his death." "No," I said, speaking for the first time since entering the room. "It wasn't. My father placed his shares in a blind trust, with instructions that they be transferred to me on my 35th birthday. That was last Tuesday, the same day you fired me." Recognition dawned in Darren's eyes, followed quickly by calculation. He straightened, adjusting his tie in a gesture I'd seen him use when preparing to assert control in difficult meetings. "Even if this is true," he said, his voice regaining some of its usual smoothness, "it doesn't change the fact that under my leadership, Northern Sky has seen unprecedented growth in revenue and market visibility. The board has repeatedly expressed their satisfaction with our new direction. A direction that has compromised patient care, endangered lives, and betrayed the core mission of Northern Sky," I countered, nodding to Ruth, who began distributing our evidence files to each board member. I've compiled extensive documentation of how your modernization initiative has resulted in increased response times for emergency calls, decreased maintenance standards for critical equipment, and the prioritization of corporate clients over emergency medical transport. As the board members began to flip through the files, I continued, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through me. Northern Sky was founded to serve as a lifeline for all Alaskans, not as a luxury transport service for the privileged few. Under your leadership, Mr. Whitmore, that mission has been systematically undermined in favor of cosmetic improvements and profit margins. Darren's face flushed with anger. This is a personal vendetta, he snapped. You're bitter about being removed from a position you weren't qualified for, and now you're trying to sabotage the company out of spite. This isn't about me, I said quietly. It's about Northern Sky. It's about the 4 fishermen who nearly died last week because you ordered a helicopter to remain on standby for a VIP client instead of responding to their emergency. It's about the maintenance delays that have put both our crews and our patients at risk. It's about the fact that you've cut training budgets while tripling expenditures on marketing and client relations. I gestured to the presentation still displayed on the screen behind him. Glossy images of Northern Sky helicopters set against dramatic Alaskan landscapes, with the tagline, "Elevate Your Experience," prominently featured. This isn't what Northern Sky is about, I said, addressing the board members now. It never has been. My father built this company to save lives, not to provide luxury transportation for corporate executives and tourists. And as the majority shareholder, I intend to ensure that Northern Sky returns to that mission. One of the board members, an older man named Richard Harmon, who had been a friend of my father's, looked up from the evidence file with a troubled expression. These response time statistics, he said slowly. They show a 40% increase in average wait times for emergency calls over the past 8 months. Is this accurate? Yes, I confirmed. And if you look at page 12, you'll see that these delays correlate directly with the implementation of Mr. Whitmore's new dispatch protocols, which give priority to scheduled corporate transports over emergency calls in certain situations. Another board member, a woman I recognized as the CEO of a local bank, frowned as she examined a different section of the file. And these financial records indicate that funds allocated for equipment maintenance were diverted to marketing campaigns and executive retreats, without board approval. Darren stepped forward, his face tight with suppressed fury. These figures are being presented without context, he insisted. Our marketing initiatives have increased Northern Sky's profile and attracted high-value clients who provide stable, predictable revenue streams. As for maintenance, we've simply optimized the schedule to improve efficiency. Efficiency? I repeated incredulously. Is that what you call it when a tail rotor inspection is delayed 3 times because the maintenance budget has been redirected to pay for promotional videos? Or when emergency medical equipment is downgraded to save costs while you're spending thousands on new uniforms designed by a fashion consultant? I nodded to Ruth, who removed a final set of documents from her briefcase and placed them on the table. As majority shareholder, I am calling for an immediate vote on the following resolutions. First, the removal of Darren Whitmore as CEO of Northern Sky Medevac, effective immediately. Second, the appointment of an interim management committee to oversee operations until a new CEO can be selected. Darren laughed, though the sound held no humor. This is absurd. You can't just walk in here and take over. You have no experience running a company. You're a dispatcher, for God's sake. I'm an operations director with 14 years of experience at Northern Sky, I corrected calmly. I know every aspect of this business, from dispatch to maintenance to medical protocols. And more importantly, I understand what Northern Sky is meant to be. You never did. I turned to address the board directly. I recognize that some of you supported Mr. Whitmore's vision for Northern Sky. You believed his promises of increased profitability and market expansion. But the evidence before you shows the true cost of that vision: compromised safety, declining service quality, and a fundamental betrayal of our mission. As shareholders, you need to decide whether that's a cost you're willing to bear. The room fell silent as the board members exchanged glances, many continuing to flip through the evidence files with growing concern. Darren stood rigid at the head of the table, his careful facade of control crumbling visibly. "This is a hostile takeover," he finally said, his voice tight with anger. "And I will fight it with every legal means at my disposal." "It's not a takeover," I replied evenly. "It's a correction. Northern Sky is returning to its true purpose." I looked around the table. "I call for a vote on the resolution to remove Darren Whitmore as CEO, effective immediately. As majority shareholder, I vote in favor." One by one, the board members cast their votes. To my surprise, several who had previously supported Darren now voted with me, clearly shaken by the evidence in front of them. Even those who abstained did not vote against the resolution. The outcome was decisive. "The resolution passes," Ruth announced formally. "Darren Whitmore is removed as CEO of Northern Sky Medevac, effective immediately." Darren stared at me, his expression a mixture of disbelief and fury. "You'll regret this," he said softly. "Northern Sky needs someone who understands modern business realities, not some mechanic's daughter clinging to outdated ideals." I met his gaze steadily. "Northern Sky needs someone who understands that in our business, minutes matter more than marketing, and lives matter more than luxury. It always has." I gestured to the door. "Security will escort you to clear out your office. Your personal belongings will be sent to you." As if on cue, two security officers appeared in the doorway, the same ones who had undoubtedly been instructed to escort me from the building just a week ago. They looked uncertain, glancing between Darren and me, until Ruth handed them the board resolution confirming his removal. With a final glare in my direction, Darren straightened his tie, gathered his presentation materials, and strode from the room, the security officers following close behind. In the silence that followed his departure, I felt the weight of all eyes on me, waiting to see what would happen next. I took a deep breath, then addressed the remaining board members. "I understand that this has been unexpected," I said. "And I want to assure you that I have no intention of dismantling the progress Northern Sky has made under Mr. Whitmore's leadership, at least, not the genuine progress. Expanded service areas, increased capacity, improved public awareness of our services, these are all valuable. But they cannot come at the expense of our core mission or the safety of our patients and crew." I outlined my plan for an interim management committee, comprised of experienced Northern Sky staff from operations, medical, and maintenance departments, to oversee the company until a permanent leadership structure could be established. To my relief, the board approved the plan with minimal objection, perhaps still too shocked by the day's events to mount significant resistance. As the meeting adjourned and the board members filed out, some still discussing the revelations in hushed tones, Ruth touched my arm lightly. "Congratulations," she said quietly. "Jack would be proud." I nodded, feeling a complex mixture of emotions, relief, vindication, and a deep sense of responsibility for what came next. "This is just the beginning, isn't it?" "Yes," Ruth agreed. "Now comes the hard part, rebuilding Northern Sky according to your vision, not just removing what didn't work." "Not my vision," I corrected. "My father's vision. Northern Sky as it was meant to be." After the board dispersed, I took a moment alone in the now empty boardroom. Through the windows, I could see the mountains that had given Northern Sky its name, their peaks sharp against the clear autumn sky. Somewhere out there, our helicopters were flying, carrying medics to those who needed them most. That was what mattered, not sleek marketing campaigns or luxury amenities, but the fundamental promise Northern Sky made to the people of Alaska. We will reach you. We will help you, no matter where you are. With that thought firmly in mind, I left the boardroom and headed not to the CEO's office, as might have been expected, but to the operations center on the ground floor. That was where the real work of Northern Sky happened, and that was where I needed to be. The operations center was buzzing with activity when I arrived. Dispatchers coordinating flights, medical staff preparing for calls, mechanics reviewing maintenance schedules. A hush fell over the room as I entered, followed by a wave of whispers as word of what had happened upstairs began to spread. Marcus Chen approached me first, his expression a mixture of confusion and hope. "Val? What's going on? There's a rumor that Darren's been fired and you're in charge somehow?" I nodded, suddenly aware of how strange the day's events must seem to those who didn't know about my father's arrangement. "It's a long story," I said. "One I'll explain to everyone soon. But yes, Darren is gone, and Northern Sky is—" I paused, searching for the right words. "Northern Sky is going back to its roots." A slow smile spread across Marcus's face. "Well, it's about damn time." Over the next few hours, I gathered the key staff members who would form the interim management committee. Marcus as chief medical officer, Michael from dispatch, Jenny from accounting, and Elena Reyes, our most experienced maintenance engineer. Together, we began the process of assessing exactly what changes Darren had implemented and which needed to be immediately reversed to ensure safe, effective operations. The most urgent issue was the dispatch protocol that had prioritized corporate clients over emergency calls. That was changed immediately, with Michael drafting a new policy that clearly established emergency medical transport as our primary mission, with corporate and private transport services accommodated only when they didn't conflict with that mission. Next was the maintenance schedule, which Elena reported had become dangerously backlogged due to budget constraints. We allocated emergency funds to bring in additional certified technicians to clear the backlog and established a new protocol that placed safety checks on a non-negotiable schedule, regardless of budgetary concerns. By late evening, we had addressed the most critical issues, though we all knew there would be months of work ahead to fully realign Northern Sky with its original mission. As the others departed, promising to return early the next morning to continue our work, I found myself alone in the operations center, the quiet hum of the computers and radio equipment the only sound. I walked slowly around the room, touching the familiar equipment, remembering how my father had taught me to use each piece, how he had explained the importance of every component in Northern Sky's mission. On the wall hung a faded photograph of him standing beside our first helicopter, his expression serious but his eyes alight with purpose. "We did it, Dad," I whispered to the empty room. We took it back. I didn't go to the CEO's office that night, or any night in the weeks that followed. Instead, I returned to my old position in operations, working alongside the staff to rebuild Northern Sky from the inside out. We canceled the Northern Sky Elite program that Darren had been so proud of, redirecting those resources to improve our emergency response capabilities. We reinstated the training programs that had been cut, rehired the experienced staff who had been let go, and recommitted to the principle that had guided Northern Sky from its founding. Every life matters, regardless of wealth or status. It wasn't an easy transition. Some board members resigned in protest at the change in direction, and a few corporate clients took their business elsewhere when they realized that they would no longer receive preferential treatment. But for every loss, there seemed to be a gain. Increased morale among the staff, improved relationships with rural communities who relied on our services, and a renewed sense of purpose throughout the organization. 1 month after taking control of Northern Sky, I finally visited the CEO's office. It had been cleared of Darren's belongings, but not yet reoccupied. The space oddly impersonal without his collection of awards and artfully arranged photographs. I stood in the doorway, considering the large desk, the view of the mountains, the distance from the operations center where the real work of Northern Sky happened. After a moment's reflection, I closed the door and walked away. The next day, I had the office converted into a break room for the medical staff, with comfortable couches for resting between flights and a large table where they could share meals together. The CEO's desk was donated to a local school. Instead, I established my workspace in a corner of the operations center, where I could be accessible to the staff and remain connected to the day-to-day activities of Northern Sky. It wasn't conventional leadership, perhaps, but it felt right for a company that had always valued substance over appearance. 6 months after taking control of Northern Sky, I stood in the hangar watching as our newest helicopter was prepared for its first flight. Unlike the sleek, corporate-styled machines Darren had ordered, this one was built for function, equipped with the latest medical technology, reinforced for Alaska's harsh conditions, painted in our traditional blue and white with Northern Sky Medivac clearly displayed on its sides. Marcus joined me as the rotors began to turn, their rhythmic thumping echoing through the hangar. "First flight to Barrow," he said. "Medical supply delivery and a clinic support mission." I nodded, watching as the helicopter lifted smoothly into the air. Not as glamorous as transporting oil executives, but more important. "Much more important," Marcus agreed. He hesitated, then added, "You know, there's talk among the staff. They've noticed something." "What's that?" I asked, still watching the helicopter as it banked north and disappeared into the distance. "The response times," he said. "They're better than they've ever been. Better even than when your father was running things. And the staff turnover rate has dropped to almost zero." I smiled slightly. "That's good to hear." "It's more than good," Marcus insisted. "It's remarkable. Everyone expected you to simply restore Northern Sky to what it was under Jack. But you've made it better. Val, you've taken his vision and expanded it." I thought about that as we walked back toward the operations center. Had I changed Northern Sky, or simply restored it to what it was always meant to be? Perhaps both were true. My father had built Northern Sky with a clear purpose, to serve as a lifeline for all Alaskans. But he had also known that the company would need to evolve, to adapt to changing conditions and technologies. What mattered was that we remained true to that core purpose, that we never lost sight of why Northern Sky existed in the first place, not for profit, not for prestige, but for people. As we entered the operations center, I noticed something new on the wall beside my father's photograph. Someone had painted a simple phrase in blue letters. "She didn't scream, she steered." "What's this?" I asked, running my fingers over the painted words. Michael looked up from the dispatch console, a slightly embarrassed smile on his face. "Oh, it's something Elena said after the shareholder meeting, about how you handled everything. It kind of became a thing around here. Hope you don't mind." I shook my head, oddly touched by the simple tribute. "I don't mind." Later that day, as I reviewed maintenance schedules and flight plans, my phone rang. It was Ruth, calling with news about the final board resignations and the candidates we were considering as replacements, people who understood and supported Northern Sky's mission. "How are things at the front lines?" she asked when our business was concluded. "Busy," I replied. 2 emergency calls this morning, a supply delivery to Barrow, and a medevac from a fishing vessel near Kodiak scheduled for this afternoon. "And how are you, Valerie?" Ruth's voice softened. "It's been a whirlwind 6 months." I glanced around the operations center, at the staff working with quiet efficiency, at the wall map showing our helicopter's current positions across Alaska, at my father's photograph and the painted words beside it. "I'm good," I said, surprised to realize how true it was. "Really good. This is where I'm supposed to be." "Ruth, this is what Northern Sky is supposed to be." "Jack would be proud," she said, "not for the first time. Not just of what you've done with the company, but of who you've become." After we hung up, I sat for a moment in quiet reflection. 6 months ago, I had been fired from the company my father built, dismissed as irrelevant by a man who thought image mattered more than substance. Today, Northern Sky was back on course, its mission clear, its future secure. Not because I had screamed about the injustice of my dismissal, but because I had steered the company back to its true purpose with calm determination and clear vision. That, I thought, was a lesson worth remembering. The radio crackled with an incoming emergency call, and I turned my attention back to the work at hand. There would be time for reflection later. Right now, somewhere in Alaska, someone needed help. And Northern Sky would be there, just as my father had intended, just as it always should be. 1 year to the day after Darren Whitmore had fired me from Northern Sky. I stood on the tarmac in the early morning light, watching as our helicopters prepared for the day's missions. The air was crisp with autumn cold, the mountains sharp against the dawn sky, their peaks already dusted with the first snow of the season. It had been a year of challenges and changes, of rebuilding and renewal. Northern Sky's response times were now the best in our history, our safety record impeccable, our relationships with the communities we served stronger than ever. We had expanded our services not by chasing corporate contracts, but by establishing new outposts in underserved areas, ensuring that our reach extended to those who needed us most. The financial picture had improved as well, though not in the ways Darren might have envisioned. Without the excessive spending on marketing and executive perks, our operating costs had decreased significantly. Grants and partnerships with rural health initiatives had provided new sources of funding. And, somewhat ironically, our renewed focus on our core mission had attracted positive attention from corporations who valued our expertise and commitment to service. As the first helicopter lifted off, I felt a presence beside me and turned to find Marcus, coffee in hand, his breath visible in the cold air. "Early start?" he asked, offering me the second cup he carried. I accepted it gratefully. "Couldn't sleep, too much on my mind." "Anniversary thoughts?" he guessed, his gaze following the helicopter as it disappeared into the brightening sky. I nodded. "A year ago today, I was cleaning out my office, thinking it was all over." Marcus chuckled. "And now look at you, running the place, just like Jack always meant you to." "Not just like he meant," I corrected. "I think he wanted me to find my own way of leading Northern Sky, not just follow in his footsteps." We walked back toward the hangar in companionable silence, the day's activities beginning around us as staff arrived for their shifts. At the entrance to the operations center, I paused to touch the frame of my father's photograph, a habit I'd developed over the past year. "We made it, Dad," I whispered, as I did each morning. Then I turned to the work of the day, to the maps and schedules and logistics that kept Northern Sky flying, kept us reaching those who couldn't be reached, saving those who might otherwise be lost. Not with screams of outrage at the injustice of the world, but with the steady hand of someone who knew exactly where we were going and why it mattered that we get there.